digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined by Brian Baglow, who joins us once again. We also have with us Paul, formerly from Team Rock as well. And we have Gemma Milne, who is the host of the illustrious Science Disrupt. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
And girl.
Hi.
So, for the benefit of our audiences, because Team Rock is no more, and you are all on to doing wondrous new things, would you care to share with us a little bit about who you are, what you have done in terms of Team Rock, and what you are doing at the moment? Brian, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So at the end of 2016, Paul and I were working for Team Rock, big music media company, running the games team, which became the innovation team. And we were looking at a huge range of different projects to help take the company's 30 years worth of archives, plus all of its ongoing output, and, do something interesting with it, quite frankly. Unfortunately, the company closed down at the end of December, just before Christmas, in fact, which was a bit of a blow. So I'm now off. I'm doing a couple of freelance bits and pieces, but Paul and I and the rest of the former Team Rock Games team are now looking at starting our own thing, which will be focusing on those very areas, oddly enough. So we're looking at games, game technology, games tools, games techniques, gamification, and trying to make it work in a lot of different areas, because the fixation that games companies have with just making games, I feel, is missing out on a lot of the opportunities.
Okay. And Gemma, why don't you explain a little bit to us about what you're up to with Science Disrupt?
Sure. So yeah, I'm co-founder of Science Disrupt, which is, well, it started off as a podcast, but we're now doing events and editorial, and we have a sort of large online community as well. And basically, we're all about connecting up the innovators, iconoclasts, and entrepreneurs, as we call them, who are creating change in science. So we basically think that science is at a point right now, a sort of tipping point that technology was about 20 years ago, in the sense that technology used to be quite closed off, quite slow, quite sort of far away from the public. It was seen as very difficult to get into. Science is currently like that, but it's starting to adopt things like startup mentality, collaboration, openness, and basically we just cover what's going on in that. So interviewing Nobel Prize winners or startup founders that are doing things specific to do with science, and basically trying to work out what's going on in the wonderful world of science innovation, science disruption.
Did I see recently that you was interviewing with somebody from CERN?
Yes, we did.
Rockstar.
Yeah, I think it was our most recent podcast, or I've lost track of days. But yeah, we interviewed the president of council at CERN, Cybron de Jong, who was awesome, and he was talking about how can we basically spin out all the amazing technology that they've had to invent in order to do this crazy basic science that is particle physics at CERN. And, everyone's going, oh, but what's the use of CERN? Why should we be spending money on it? And it's like, well, the World Wide Web was actually invented there, and they've created these super awesome magnets and all this other stuff. So he's all about spinning it out into the world of startups. So yeah, that was a super awesome conversation.
Wonderful. Okay, and Paul, why don't you tell us more about what you've been up to previously and post Team Rock?
Oh, well, as you know, great. As Brian just says, made redundant at the end of Christmas, but before I started working at Team Rock, I was working at places like Access Animations, doing my own stuff, and working up a couple of games companies at Dundee. Now that I'm back, as Brian says, we're starting up a own lead company with the rest of Team Rock to kind of look at producing games for businesses to engage their audiences with. I'm also currently working on my own stuff at the same time. So I've got a small lead company called Pixel Sword, and right now I'm just currently working on a game called Pixel Raiders. So there's a small theme there, and it's just basically an old school arcade shooter, kind of that takes kind of like Space Invaders and Centipede, old kind of Atari classics, and just kind of does something a wee bit new with them.
Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome back, everybody, because you've all been on the show before at some point in time. And since we've kind of got you all back, I'm thinking about the fact that you're all doing really interesting things that maybe are looking at the reapplication of technology in certain different ways. And I find this very, very interesting because right now, in the heart of the VR industry, one of the things that we find to be most common is that most people are looking at VR for gaming, or, how do I make a film or a game in VR, essentially. And there tends to be this kind of lack of insight into all of the other possibilities and the scope of what the technology is really capable of and how it can be applied to other industries. And this kind of comes back to what Brian was saying about game studios in general being very focused on the entertainment of it all and, as Brian would say, blowing things up. And I am curious, first of all, to hear from you, Gemma, because of this conversation that you actually just had with Kern. And I think this is really relevant, not just in the games industry, but just in general with technology and with new emerging ideas and innovation. This idea that there are so many industries where people are very siloed and very insular in their understanding. And as it is with VR, we're in our bubble and we don't see beyond our bubble at the moment. And I suppose that's very similar from a scientific community perspective as well, of, thinking about it in terms of pure mathematics or pure, physics or pure whatever the science is, and not necessarily looking at these outside forces of influence that could potentially add a new dimension or something innovative to what people are thinking about doing at the moment. And I'm curious from your perspective of the conversation that you had with Kern, where you think that there is this possible intersection between entertainment and technology, and what you think that the potentially the most interesting applications of that combination could be.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you talked about silos. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that we talk about a lot within science, is that not only are the scientists, even within the field of biology, there'll be silos. So you'll have, the cell scientists on one side, and then you'll have the synthetic biologists on another side, and then you'll have, the scientist that looks specifically at hamsters on another side, whatever. It's extremely siloed, even in places that you'd think there'd be a lot of collaboration. So, I mean, from our perspective at Science Disrupt, that really halts progress in a lot of different ways because, say, for instance, you're working on a problem to do with, I don't know, say, for instance, my co-founder, he's a cell biologist, so he looks at the motion of cells and he has to image cells. So he has to basically make these models that are able to look at how a cell moves in particular ways, right? For a biologist, that's super important when you're thinking about flow of proteins and why cells move and therefore how cells spread. And then you can look at cancer applications, so on and so forth. But when you look at it, say, from a physics perspective, it's a fluid dynamics problem. It's how does, fluid move? And for someone who's a cell biologist who is not privy to how fluid dynamics work, you've basically got this massive hole of knowledge that stops people from, I guess, taking the next step that can allow for discovery. So that's just within science. When you then take a step out of that and go, okay, well, we've just worked this particular thing out about, I don't know, this material or this biological system or whatever, and then you think, okay, could anyone outside of the realm of research use this? I mean, the biggest problem in science is the way that we share knowledge is absolutely terrible. I mean, without going into whole detail, basically scientific publishing is massively screwed up, and it means that people can either they don't have mental or physical access to scientific discovery because of the way it's written and the way it's published. So you've got all these people outside of science who aren't researchers, who aren't PhDs, who aren't even working in technology, who might have a really, really good use of the science, who can't even access a discovery, who doesn't even know that this sort of thing's going on. And that's a massive problem. And so that's going from science outside. When you look at sort of outside going into science, is the exact same problem. Scientists aren't looking outside of their immediate realm for solutions to problems. So, we were talking a little bit about entertainment and gaming here. There are so many examples of how gaming has been used to advance discovery. For instance, there's a whole area called citizen science where you have games created for people all around the world to download onto their phone, to play on a computer, to do whatever. And it's a simple game of pattern spotting most of the time. They have to do a particular task or whatever to win points. But behind that, it's actually looking for patterns for cancer discovery or the folding of proteins or whatever. Things that require the power of the human brain to find patterns that scientists can't cannot physically do without crap loads of people. So they create these games and it helps with discovery. So, there's lots of examples of how gaming and entertainment can aid. I mean, look, what was that film? Oh my God, it's totally escaped. So not Gravity, the other one. And they made a simulation of a black hole. And that actually was done using real physicists, real research.
You're referring to Interstellar.
That's it, Interstellar. and that was, there's been, I think it's 3 papers now that have been published off the back of the work that was done in visualizing how a black hole would function in this movie. So that's one sort of quite big money scale.
It's interesting though that you bring this up, because actually one of the things that is very common for certainly the movie industry, and in some ways the games industry, but it tends to be a little bit underneath the surface so you don't see it as much, but certainly with the film industry, what we see is the practice of world building, as we might refer to it, or transmedia, narrative architecture, where we're talking about this collective journey of, rather than the hero's journey, where all of the narratives and all of these parts need to come together in order to facilitate this collective shared journey of the community and the mass, if you like, the hive mind as such. And it's quite interesting that we see this kind of thing happen quite a lot with things like Minority Report or all these other kind of very, very big, broad scoping universes. I suppose Star Trek or even to a certain extent Marvel would be considered as similar hive style, transmedia universes. And these happen, where when we're looking certainly at sci-fi and futuristic worlds and environments, that quite a lot of research is done, quite a lot of very near science stuff is explored and drilled down into. And we look at these things where it's, very, very close to the cusp of possibility. And we talk about that what if. And it's just that one little step to the what if of just nudging that science a little bit further to come up with the scientific or the sci-fi variant of what that thing could be. And that's very, very common, certainly in the film industry, that we see that kind of thing realised on the picture and on the screen that we see. But it's also very common in the games industry as well, when we're creating these huge storytelling narrative universes where there's a multitude of science that exists. And sure, that sometimes, people, all they're seeing is spaceships and aliens, and they're thinking, this is so far beyond the possibility of reality. But actually, if you drill down into some of this stuff, there's actually a lot of history that's gone into this, a lot of mapping of the history of mankind through to the point at which we see starships and aliens.
If you look at things like Jules Verne, I mean, he was the first author to I think it was From the Earth to the Moon, and he spoke about spaceships that were going to be powered by light. So that was the first talk of solar, and that was all about powering spaceships, which that is how we power our rockets or satellites and so on right now. But now we also power things on Earth using solar, and that was the first mention of it, and that was in sci-fi. I mean, there's lots of work that's been done around, I guess, the way in which, for entertainment purposes, we're kind of building stories and narratives based on, it's kind of like thought experiments in a way. It's kind of like thinking, okay, if the world was in a state that we could have perfect genetic engineering, what would happen? And then you start building a story around that. I mean, that most of sci-fi is that. It's a kind of, as you said, of what if. And a lot of time that paves the way for discovery, because it makes people start thinking about the ethics around discovery. It makes people start thinking about, okay, well, what if that would happen? I mean, think about AI and robotics. I mean, most of our worries and our kind of things that hold us back and things that make us build AI and robotics in a way that's a lot more thoughtful has come from us exploring the idea of killer robots and crazy artificial intelligence through entertainment. And one thing I always like to say is, if you think about it, when we're creating entertainment, we're thinking, how would we like the world to be, or what could the world be? We're doing a bit of, I guess, experimenting in our minds, which is how science works. You start by asking a question and then you go out and try and solve it. So it's a very similar process.
It's interesting when you think about that process and the similarities to the games industry. Gemma there is commenting about this idea of kind of trying to visualize what the world should be like or could be like, and then realizing that through the application of science and laws and rules that we know of that exist in science. But Brian, I'm curious from your perspective, in a games industry perspective, in a kind of a games design perspective, the similarities to those types of processes that bring us to these end game conclusions of these massive, games. And typically it's the MMOs, the massively multiplayer online games and RPGs, where you see this huge amount of energy creating a huge universe that may have taken 10 or even 15 years to really evolve into what it is now. But these universes and these communities are very much open to, I'm not going to say abuse, but utilization by practical real world application. And as Gemma rightly points out, this hive mind application of being able to use these big communities and game community behaviors to solve massive problems, such as cancer and identifying various issues to do with cancer cells and how they work. This was done by a hive mind, this was done by a community mind, this was work that was done out of MIT Play Labs, and it was very much using gamification and game community methodologies to bring people together to get them to solve these problems. And I'm curious from your perspective, Brian, what you see as the starting point for the games industry to actively take hold of these opportunities, rather than it being something that's kind of stumbled upon by other areas.
So I think one of the interesting things that you see in a lot of the larger online games, or any game which has a community around it, is the whole notion of emergent behaviour. And in many cases you actually see players engaging in behaviours that the designers didn't originally anticipate or hadn't planned for, but they take the tools and the technical capabilities that they have and use it in entirely new ways. And those ways can be everything from creating your own community or setting up your own particular laws or rules or regulations, through to things like griefing. And it's something that smart game designers are now starting to.
Okay. For the sake of our non-game listeners, Brian, just explain griefing to people who don't necessarily play lots and lots of games, because there might be a few of them.
Oh, it's very simple. It's basically being a dick. It's going in. And
I was hoping it was going to be far more technical than that.
Well, I could actually sort of come in on the socio-political angle and how it's actually giving, the disenfranchised a voice within an artificial community, but no, it's just mostly people being dickish to each other.
Okay.
And that is the technical description. So I would absolutely say that those sorts of behaviours can be used for real world causes and in the pursuit of real world solutions. Jane McGonigal, the game designer, has done an awful lot of work on how to harness the amount of time that people put in to their gaming and use that to solve problems in the real world. Mm. And we've seen some evidence of that. It's the PlayStation 3 had a protein folding game included in it, where you could go and actually start to try and help medical research by figuring out how different proteins could be folded to help the development of drugs. And indeed, we've seen games from several companies that have to do with using either clinical data or generating research for medical or scientific purposes. Up in Scotland, we've got two companies, Chunk in Glasgow and Gorilla Tea in Dundee, who worked with Cancer Research UK to go and actually create games that used real-world scientific data. So it can be done, but those tend to be the exceptions rather than the rules. And one of the things that we really suffer from, as Gemma was saying earlier, is the notion of silos and the notion of compartmentalization. Games still has this notion that there are real games and then there's everything else. And real games happen on consoles and tend to involve Space Marines and machine guns or laser rifles, and everything else is not really worth talking about. That's clearly mental, because there are a huge number of ways in which games have pioneered lots of things like user engagement and how players interact with devices and how players interact with each other within the context of the game. But it tends to get left at the entertainment level, and very few people actually look beyond that and say, well, actually, all of these techniques are fantastic in terms of building an audience, getting that audience engaged, getting them to act creatively. So we can still do an awful lot more, and the more contact that we have with, the scientists and educators and engineers and technicians and artists and creatives from all over the world, then the better, because we have these incredible tools in the game sector that are there to be used, and in a lot of cases they're free and can be picked up by almost anyone. We just need to stop thinking about blowing stuff up, collecting coins, rescuing princesses, or any of the sort of familiar tropes and genres that the games industry has fallen prey to.
It's interesting that you bring up Jane McGonigal. So Professor Jane McGonigal, author of such publications as Reality is Broken, and also participant at MIT Play Labs, amongst others. I find it really interesting because obviously one of the things that Jane is known for is the kind of real world application of gaming and game techniques and what some might call serious gaming, and using it to identify how to create behaviours with audiences that can help to have real world impact. But it leads me to this conclusion, is this question, I suppose, of the fact that gaming in and of itself isn't necessarily taken seriously in the same way as you say gaming in the same sentence as science, and obviously people will take science far more seriously as something that can have real and lasting impact, versus necessarily gaming, which actually can have very real and lasting impact, but people don't necessarily see it in that way because they're thinking of it as quite a throwaway activity and a throwaway genre in many ways, as the thing you don't take seriously. In the same way that, when you are talking to the average teenager and saying, what do you want to do with your life? Their families would hope that they're going to say, I'll be a doctor or a lawyer or, some other serious job title, versus necessarily, I want to be in the games industry, which is considered as quite frivolous. And I'm curious, Paul, from your perspective, how you see this perception of the games industry and the perception of what games are capable of as being a barrier to necessarily engaging with more real world and serious application of what the opportunity is for the games industry.
Well, I think the major problem is that games, the major genres in games are, as Brian says, save princesses, blow shit up, that's the kind of the main premise behind games. There's no real, like with film and TV, there's no kind of documentary kind of category in games. There's no real one there. So there's no kind of, as an adult now game, there's no real learning games kind of designed for me that are interesting and fun. There's no games there about kind of science kind of stuff, like any kind of physics-based games that would really kind of inspire me to learn about physics. There's nothing there for me. There's tons of that type of games for kids, for learning basic maths, basic science, stuff like that. There's nothing there really for adults. And that could be a shame, but there might not be a market there, and there might be a market there, but no one's really kind of tapped into it to see if it's there. So yeah.
I think that's interesting because when you think about it, I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people playing games such as Candy Crush Saga, any of these kind of what people might call casual games or mobile games, and yet there isn't this necessarily this insight into the fact that, well, okay, if pretty much everybody in the world has a smartphone or a mobile phone in their hand, in their pocket, and pretty much all of these phones are capable of having a game on them that people can play, there isn't really anybody who's leveraging that and saying, actually, I've got an entire, global audience of adults who could potentially be participating in something that is meaningful, worthwhile, and has scientific impact. And I'm curious as to when we think something like that might occur. Gemma, have you seen any kind of indications yet from the scientific community of that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the whole sort of citizen science movement is something that a lot of scientific institutions are really looking into. So, for instance, the Natural History Museum have been doing a lot of work around getting people to identify species, for instance. It's massive in astronomy. So a lot of planets and constellations and various other bits and bobs tend to be found by people scouring images of the night sky. So there is a movement in terms of citizen science. Oh, and Nesta as well, they're doing a lot of stuff to do with dementia and doing a lot of sort of health researches to do with citizen science. I have a big bugbear with citizen science in a lot of ways because I feel sometimes it's not necessarily using intellect of people, but more their ability to tap a screen.
It's more drone work than anything intellectual. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually quite a missed opportunity, especially when it comes to gamers, because as I certainly see gaming, yes, okay, you mentioned before some of the perception as a frivolous activity, but I would see it as, well, this is problem solving, especially games that I'm not an expert gamer, but that don't have a set theme. They're kind of just open missions, or however you call it. You kind of have to piece together quite a complex world using your brain, and that's a quite a complex task that actually, we're now trying to simulate with computers. That's neural networks, that's deep learning and AI. So the power is there, and I think we're getting more openness within the science community to start using citizens, as they call them, to try and help with research. I would love it if we could start using not just sort of taps on phones, but more the sort of problem-solving ability of the masses in order to really do things. I mean, Brian, I think it was you earlier that mentioned around the protein folding stuff. I mean, that was incredible work that went on. Again, it was a sort of simple game, but it was using these problem-solving abilities. And if you can create a game that's fun, that people want to do, that doesn't feel like I'm doing this graft work for a scientist, then what's to say that we can't, really tackle some massive data sets that is one of the biggest problems in science, especially in biology, where you don't have very many people who are that able to do anything to do with data. I mean, most biologists record their data using a pen and paper. So genuinely, I mean, that's not an exaggeration. So there's a lot of untapped potential, both from the sort of tech side and the data crunching side, but also just the mass amount of people, because being able to trawl through that much data is almost impossible for a lot of scientists. And we're at a point now that we've gathered all the low-hanging fruit in science, and a lot of biology is now going to be data analysis, and you need more minds, more people, and more complex minds, as it were. Obviously, that's where machine intelligence is coming in, but we're not there yet.
But that is an edge. We're edging into an area where actually games is moving closer and closer into AI and machine learning, and being able to actually be more intelligent with these emergent narratives and that application and use of more artificial intelligent insertions into the game engines. So I think there is this kind of crossover point where it's coming closer and closer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think AI is definitely, it's a bit of a buzzword, I guess, but I think most industries are starting to be like, okay, how can I use this to better what I'm doing?
And let's be specific, we mean narrow AI.
Yeah, no, of course. Not generally, although mind you, DeepMind are doing some incredible stuff to do with health.
This is true.
You think about, like, they're doing a lot of stuff to do with optics and kidneys, and they're doing exactly that. They're using AI to spot patterns and to find things that humans, because it takes so long, haven't been able to do. I mean, IBM Watson, they managed to find, I can't remember what the actual story was, but there was something around cancer detection where all the years of medical research have been able to find, I think it was like 5 markers for a particular type of cancer. And they fed into Watson all of the medical data around this particular type of cancer, what markers had what people had what markers, and what the outcome was, and whether or not the tumor turned into full-blown cancer or not. And in the end, the system managed to find 12 different markers. And that's not generally AI. They're trying to get there, but it's not necessarily the most complex stuff that we've managed to do, and yet we're already being able to do amazing things like that. So I kind of see any form of collaboration with any place a good thing for science, and a good thing for everyone, really. And I think AI is one part of that, but I think there's so many different elements of entertainment and gaming. When you were talking about narratives, when you're talking about being able to build things in a way. I mean, even visualization is huge. The development opportunities within gaming, Unity developers, science has like hardly any of that, and a large part of science is visualization. So you just being able to collaborate with people who can make stuff visually that works in 3D. That's huge.
Data visualization is definitely an area that needs to be explored more. There's so much potential for the games industry there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And not just in science. I mean, even things like politics, being able to explain things better, or being able to tell people about statistics in a way that makes sense. Or,
or for just financial data, financial information. But, one of the things that I find really interesting is the idea that actually in the games industry, one of the kind of the fundamental basics and possibly a myth that a lot of people like to have about the games industry and developers specifically is, we're all in our darkened studios and, we're all sat there staring at our own individual screens and we don't really communicate or interact with others terribly well. But the irony is in fact, actually, people in the games industry and certainly developers are very collaborative people by nature. It's very, very rare that you have somebody who individually begins the process of coding something and does the entire, development entirely on their own. There's always this handoff and this tag teaming that happens where, there's a trade-off of where certain people are particularly strong in, front end or back end or whatever their, aspect is of what they're doing. It's not an insular experience. One person doesn't do it all. And because of that, we have these attitudes, this cultural attitude within the games industry of, collaboration, and things like game jams and hackathons are, an embodiment, if you like, of that attitude of let's just get together, let's throw some stuff together. The skills that I have, I'm going to throw into the pot with everybody else's skills and we'll see what we come out with. And I think that there is this argument to suggest that as an approach is something that we need to encourage with other outside industries, to really encourage them to get into this mixing bowl and just kind of say, whatever your particular sector is and whatever your particular skill sets are, let's throw these into the mix and let's figure out what we come out with. Because I do think that innovation and progression is naturally going to come from areas that are outside of our traditional area of experience. So I'm curious, Brian, from your perspective, you're obviously doing some work with Geek Girls up in Scotland and the mentoring program that you have going on up there. Do you see this as being something particularly that will be encouraged, is the idea of outside collaboration?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the interesting things is that having been the games guy at a huge number of events and networking things over the years, it tended to be, whether it was the creative industries, whether it was the wider technology, or wherever you were, if it wasn't a dedicated games event, and you said, I make video games, people would kind of edge away and pretend that they were going to get, go and get more wine and a bit of a refill, and you would never see them again. But now you're finding more and more of the interest, and in fact the majority of the interest in games coming from those other sectors, coming from different industries, coming from quarters that you would never really expect, because the rest of the world seems to have cottoned on to the fact that the tools, the technologies, the activity that I guess the full-scale transformation that games has undergone in the last 8 years is there to be used, and in some cases can totally transform the way that they do business, whether they're, from the way their content is created to the way it's distributed, monetized, promoted, and consumed. So there's an awful lot of interest out there, and it goes very widely. So we're many organisations from science and healthcare through to politics and indeed, the technology sectors, finally kind of accepting games as being far more than the Grand Theft Autos, Call of Duties and Space Invaders that a lot of people within the games industry tend to self-define as being the totality of game in general.
Okay.
A huge to seize this and to actually make a real difference. As Gemma was saying, even within particular disciplines, you can find some compartmentalization, some kind of siloed thinking. And for me, that because there are solutions that people don't realize because it's not happened in their particular area of expertise. And this is one of the real, because the game sector is still not, I would say, clear about its sheer scope and the range of different organisations and the type of activity. Because once you start looking at the emergent behaviours, once you start looking at, again, Gemma, you mentioned the sandbox, is crafting and survival, where players have a huge environment and they're basically dumped in, so, told to get on with it, and they have to survive. They've got to make fire, they've got to find foods, they've got to, normally fight off zombies, wild animals, some sort of. But it's a completely different way of looking at things.
Okay, so as always, we'd like to ask you to give us your thoughts on what you think will be the single biggest change that needs to occur, be that technological or culturally, within the next 5 to 10 years that you think will significantly shift the way that you do business or that your industry does business. And I am curious to hear from you, first of all, Gemma, what you think that might be.
Okay, so for me, it's a cultural change. And to try and explain it quickly, for me, it's about the attitudes towards scientific publishing. So instead of researchers always having to publish in places like Nature or Science, which are super, super expensive to publish in, very alienating for people across the board, that they start publishing more openly, that researchers are promoted because they publish openly. They're not at the moment. And therefore, scientific research will be much more open to the masses as opposed to the select few. So I think once that, and it's happening, there's a massive movement at the moment around open science, which, hashtag open science on Twitter, and you'll see all the musings about it. It's fascinating. But for me, I think once we get past the sort of proxy of having to publish in a high-end journal as opposed to just putting your research on the internet for all to see, I think once that happens and is much more accepted by the scientific community, the opportunities for building upon the world's knowledge are, I don't even know where to start. I think that.
Okay, interesting. Paul, what about you? What do you think needs to be that significant shift?
Yeah, I think it just has to be more of an openness from other communities that are kind of around games. Games has had a good relationship with history and science papers that it can get hold of. We've got probably two of the biggest game series, Mass Effect, that uses a lot of its science based on scientific papers that it could get access now in theories. And then we've got, on the history side of things, we've had abundance of basically World War II games, but we've had games like Civilization, Total War, who have looked at the past history of massive achievements done by human civilization, so from the very birth to a way ahead in the future. So I think it's just more of an openness from papers, from scientists, to share more of their research with the games industry to try to see that kind of shift change for games to take a kind of more serious kind of note in how they deal with their worlds and basically tell their stories to players.
And Brian, what about you? What do you think needs to be that shift?
I think the shift is inevitable. It's going to happen. The question for me is whether it happens despite, the mainstream games industry or with the majority of the games industry actually getting involved in it. The tools and technologies are out there. Again, as Paul says, we have examples all over the place of how games can be used in more educational ways, and a lot of commercially available games do have, some hardcore facts in there. My stepson, big fan of the Total War series, knows a surprising amount about the war on the peninsula between Wellington and Napoleon because of the game itself. So there's lots and lots of ways in which games could help to educate their audience and do more than, the sort of the jingoistic explosions that have kind of become the calling card for the mainstream industry. But I think it would be disingenuous not to mention all of the activity going in at the other end of the market, in the indie end of the market, where you do have games which are going far beyond the consumer expectations and doing things which are looking at different types of experience, from working as a border guard in a totalitarian country through to a parent who chronicled the death of his son from cancer. There are some very, very compelling experiences out there. And whether it's the actual gameplay itself, as in what the players do, what the mechanics are, or whether it's the narrative and storyline, we're no longer constrained by technology in the way that we were even, 10 years ago. And to go back to Gemma's point, it's got to be more than just taps on a screen. I couldn't agree more. The whole idea that it's got to be mediated through a joypad or through tapping a device makes no sense. We have these devices which are supremely capable, voice-enabled, location-aware, that can, do a huge amount based on the community that's playing. And nobody's really started to explore that yet, but it can't be far away because the opportunities are there. And let's be honest, doing another bubble bursting game, the first person shooter market is getting more and more difficult. So I think the shift is inevitable, but I would really like to see the games industry recognising what it has and the potential which is there. But, not too quickly, because that's what Paul and I are planning to do with
You wait till you've done it, and then everybody else can catch up. But in the interest of ensuring that our listeners are able to find out a little bit more about what you was just referring to, I'll just shout out some names there to be specific rather than just descriptive of the games in question. So that was Papers, Please was the first one, and the second one was that Dragon Cancer. So feel free to go look those up on your relevant app store or game store of choice. But in the meantime, we like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about what you're up to and follow you. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, Paul?
That's my Twitter, and it's @PixelSword1.
Wonderful, thank you. And Gemma?
It'll be my Twitter as well, which is GKMiln1. And I'm also going to say you can also do @ScienceDisrupt as well to see what we're up to there.
Wonderful. Brian, are you going to try and break out here from Twitter, or are you just going to stick with Twitter?
No, let's stick with Twitter for the time being, because my Instagram is currently full of baby pictures. So Twitter it is, and it's @FlackBoy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter @DigitalJam Ltd. DigitalJamSessions.com